January 1944, northern France. The sky is pale gray, heavy with mist and the distant hum of engines. A German reconnaissance plane cuts through the clouds, its camera lens clicking over the countryside below. From above, the fields look alive with armor. Dozens of tanks lined in perfect formation, their long barrels glinting faintly in the winter light. The pilot smirks. "Engländer Dummköpfe," he mutters. "English fools." He tilts his aircraft and heads home, eager to report a major Allied buildup. On the ground, Corporal Fred Roberts wipes sawdust from his hands. The tank beside him creaks as the wind moves through its hollow frame. It is made of timber, canvas, and paint. It weighs less than a single soldier. Roberts and his small team from the Royal Engineers have been working for days, shaping deception from wood and rope. A week later, the Germans return. Bomb bays open. Explosions tear through empty fields. No one dies, but the message is clear. The illusion worked. What began as a desperate trick of survival had just become a weapon of war. The Allies had found a way to make imagination deadly. By early 1941, the world was burning. Europe lay fractured under the weight of the German war machine. Blitzkrieg had swept across Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and France in less than a year. German divisions advanced with mechanical precision, while the Luftwaffe darkened the skies with relentless bombing runs. Across the Channel, Britain stood alone, fighting for survival after the fall of France. The British understood one truth early in the war. They could not match the Germans in brute force. The Wehrmacht's panzers, aircraft, and artillery outnumbered them. What they could match, however, was intelligence and illusion. If Germany relied on speed and shock, Britain would rely on deception and wit. The roots of military deception were not new. Since the Trojan horse, armies had used misdirection to outsmart their enemies. But in the industrial age, when aircraft and aerial photography replaced scouts and spies, deception required new forms. The battlefield had become a chessboard visible from miles above. Every tank, every trench, every supply depot could be spotted by a camera lens. The British War Office created a new division, the Camouflage Directorate. Its mission was simple but daring, to make the enemy believe what was not there and ignore what was. The task fell not to soldiers, but to artists, stage designers, architects, and engineers. Among them were men like Julian Trevelyan and Roland Penrose, surrealist painters turned masters of concealment. They would transform fields and forests into illusions. Their early experiments began in North Africa, where the harsh desert light exposed every shadow. Real tanks, when viewed from the air, cast sharp outlines and left deep tracks in the sand. The camouflage units, armed with brushes, canvas, and wooden frames, learned to break those patterns. They covered fuel trucks with fake turrets. They disguised supply depots as sand dunes. And then they built decoys, entire armored divisions made of nothing but wood and fabric. By late 1942, these efforts expanded into Europe. Dummy tanks, aircraft, and even fake airfields began to appear across Britain and occupied territories. Each was crafted to mimic the shape, scale, and spacing of real equipment. Painted shadows, metallic reflections, and false tire marks completed the illusion. From high above, they looked convincing. The Germans initially mocked them. Luftwaffe pilots returned with photographs, laughing at what they believed were crude decoys, training props, or mistakes. But the Allies were patient. They knew the real test would come when those fake armies began to attract real attacks. The idea evolved into full-scale deception operations. The goal was not only to fool pilots, but also to manipulate German intelligence. False radio transmissions, fake troop movements, and phantom supply convoys reinforced the illusion. Decoys became part of a broader psychological game. A war fought not only with bullets, but with belief. As Allied command grew more ambitious, deception became a strategic pillar. British generals recognized its potential after the success of early experiments in North Africa and Italy. The results were measurable. German bombers wasted tons of explosives on empty fields. Reconnaissance reports misled high command into overestimating Allied strength. By 1943, deception had matured into an art form. The British established Operation Bodyguard, a complex network of illusions meant to disguise the true plans for the invasion of Europe. Within it, sub-operations like Fortitude North and Fortitude South would use fake equipment, phantom armies, and double agents to convince Hitler that the D-Day invasion would strike anywhere but Normandy. But before those grand operations began, the foundation had already been laid by the humble wooden tank. What started as a desperate improvisation by carpenters and painters would grow into one of the most effective tools of the Allied campaign. The laughter from German pilots would not last long. Soon they would find themselves bombing shadows and wood, wasting precious fuel and munitions on illusions crafted by men who never fired a shot. The stage was set for a new kind of warfare, one fought through mirrors and smoke, through shapes and silence. In 1943, deception became a discipline. What had begun as makeshift camouflage now turned into a structured science. The Allies learned that the smallest detail could decide whether an illusion lived or died. A wooden tank too light might tilt under wind pressure. A dummy airfield without proper tracks could expose the lie. Every illusion had to feel real from 1,000 feet in the air. The British were the first to refine this craft. They built workshops hidden in barns and abandoned factories. Here, soldiers, carpenters, and set designers worked side by side. Timber frames were cut to the size of real tanks, draped with painted canvas, and propped up with wire. Shadows were added with black dye to mimic depth. Even the position of the sun was considered before placing a decoy. The goal was simple: fool the eye of a pilot moving at 300 miles per hour. The Royal Engineers formed specialized units known as camouflage companies. Their purpose was to construct fake bases, tanks, trucks, and artillery in active war zones. These decoys were mobile, collapsible, and cheap. In North Africa, a single wooden tank cost less than the price of a spare tire for a real one, yet its value on the battlefield was immense. By the time the United States entered the war, the British experience shaped American strategy. The U.S. Army created the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit that history would later call the Ghost Army. It consisted of artists, sound engineers, radio specialists, and designers. Their mission: to deceive, distract, and mislead. The Ghost Army became the most sophisticated deception force ever assembled. They didn't just build wooden tanks, they built entire armies out of thin air. Inflatable Sherman tanks were arranged in rows. Fake half-tracks and artillery pieces lined dirt roads. From the sky, they looked perfectly authentic. The sound division used giant speakers to project recordings of tank engines, convoys, and machinery over several miles. Radio operators transmitted coded chatter imitating real divisions. The combination of visual and auditory deception created a living mirage. Across the Eastern Front, the Soviets also embraced deception, calling it maskirovka. They camouflaged real tanks under trees, then placed wooden replicas in open ground to attract Luftwaffe bombers. The German pilots obliged, wasting fuel and ammunition on empty targets. Soviet reports later claimed that dozens of bombing raids hit nothing but plywood. In Britain, Operation Fortitude was taking shape. It would be one of the largest deception operations in history. Its purpose: to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. To sell the illusion, fake airfields were built in southern England, complete with dummy aircraft, fake hangars, and wooden anti-aircraft guns. Inflatable landing craft were stacked along the coast. Even dummy soldiers, mannequins in uniform, stood guard at fake camps. The Allies fed false intelligence through double agents like Juan Pujol Garcia, known to the Germans as Agent Garbo. His reports, combined with reconnaissance photos of the decoy installations, convinced Hitler that the Allied invasion would come at Calais. He ordered panzer divisions to remain there, waiting for an attack that would never arrive. This mastery of deception required coordination, patience, and precision. Every illusion had to align with real operational data. If a fake airfield was built, fuel convoys had to appear nearby. If a phantom army was mobilizing, radio traffic had to confirm its presence. The logistics were immense, yet the psychological payoff was priceless. By the time the first bombs fell on fake tanks, deception had changed warfare forever. Technology had met creativity. The battlefield had become a theater, and its actors, carpenters, artists, and engineers performed unseen. Their success was measured not in kills, but in confusion. The Germans, proud of their intelligence network, never realized how deeply they had been fooled. Reports flowed to Berlin, filled with certainty. Commanders adjusted plans, moved divisions, and wasted resources. Wooden tanks had become silent strategists in the greatest conflict of the modern age. From these experiments grew a philosophy that would dominate Allied operations through 1944 and beyond. Wars would still be fought with weapons, but victory would also depend on imagination. As the deception spread across continents, one question lingered among the men who built it. How far could illusion bend the truth before the enemy stopped believing their own eyes? That question would find its answer when bombs rained on nothing but wood. The war of deception was not fought only with wood and canvas. It was fought in the minds of men. The first angle of this story begins with those who built the illusions. They were not ordinary soldiers. Many had never touched a rifle before the war. They were painters, sculptors, sound engineers, and stage magicians. The British called them the camoufleurs. For these men, war became a design problem. They studied how light hit a tank's turret. They examined how tire tracks looked from the air. They even measured the way bomb craters appeared in reconnaissance photos. Every illusion demanded precision. If a shadow fell the wrong way, if a tire track ended too soon, the entire deception could collapse. Julian Trevelyan, once a surrealist artist in London, found himself designing dummy factories. Roland Penrose, another painter, trained troops on how to disguise airfields using nets and paint. The line between art and warfare blurred. A brushstroke could now mislead an entire enemy air wing. The human cost of these operations was often invisible. The men who built fake tanks did not earn medals or public fame. They worked long hours, often under shell fire, constructing illusions that could be destroyed in minutes. Some were killed when real bombs struck the fake equipment they had built. Yet their silence was their success. If the enemy dropped bombs on wood instead of steel, their mission was complete. The second angle was psychological. Deception in war plays not only on sight, but on expectation. The Germans trusted their reconnaissance. Their system of intelligence relied heavily on aerial photos and radio intercepts. When they saw rows of tanks, they believed what they saw. That trust was their weakness. The Allies understood this perfectly. They learned to build illusions that not only looked real, but behaved real. Fake convoys moved at night. Dummy tanks changed position each morning to simulate deployment. At dusk, fires were lit around fake camps to mimic the glow of mess halls. Even the rhythm of daily military life was reproduced. To an observer miles away, the illusion was seamless. The third angle was tactical. Deception gave the Allies flexibility. It bought time. By diverting enemy bombers to false positions, the real forces could move safely. Decoys also created hesitation among German commanders. They were forced to divide their resources, unsure where to strike. In some cases, entire divisions were delayed for days chasing ghosts. One of the earliest tactical uses came in North Africa. British forces used dummy tanks to suggest an armored buildup in one sector while real divisions struck from another. The deception worked. German General Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, was forced to reposition his troops based on false intelligence. The balance of maneuver shifted. The wooden tanks had no engines, yet they moved the enemy. The fourth angle was moral. Deception always walks a fine line. Some commanders questioned whether trickery had a place in honorable warfare. But as the destruction in Europe deepened, such doubts faded. The Allies realized that saving lives through illusion was not deceitful. It was strategic mercy. Every bomb dropped on a dummy tank meant fewer lives lost in real ones. There was also a quiet dignity in their work. The camoufleurs were not warriors in the traditional sense, but they fought with intellect and creativity. In a war defined by brutality, their weapon was imagination. The fifth angle was emotional. For many soldiers stationed near the decoy fields, watching bombs fall on empty targets brought a strange satisfaction. They saw proof that the enemy could be fooled, that even the mighty Luftwaffe could be tricked by shadows and paint. In a time of constant fear, deception offered something rare, control, but deception also carried risk. If discovered, it could provoke retaliation. German intelligence units began to suspect false positions. They sent agents to photograph sites and compare reports. The Allies countered by improving realism. They added burnt wrecks after attacks to sell the illusion. They even arranged for fake casualty reports to circulate through radio chatter. The game became a duel of observation and adaptation. The final angle of this section was strategic foresight. Allied planners knew that deception was not a side tactic. It was a weapon of preparation. Every decoy operation served a future purpose. Every fake airfield laid the groundwork for a larger lie. When the time came to launch the greatest invasion of the war, these illusions would form the foundation of Operation Fortitude. For now, the wooden tanks stood as silent actors in a theater of confusion. From the air, they looked like an army ready to strike. On the ground, they were hollow shells, surrounded by men who understood that appearance was power. And in that understanding lay the future of deception, a battlefield where imagination could shape strategy and illusions could decide the outcome of a war. The story of deception deepens when seen through technology. The wooden tank was only the beginning. As the war advanced, illusion evolved with it. Engineers, artists, and scientists worked together to refine trickery into an exact science. The first breakthrough came with sound. The U.S. Ghost Army developed portable loudspeaker systems capable of projecting tank and convoy noises across several miles. These soundtracks were recorded from real armored units and mixed to create layered effects: engines starting, treads grinding, metal clanking. At night, these sounds moved across valleys, suggesting entire armored divisions on the move. German listening posts, unable to verify the source, reported these phantom movements as real. The second innovation was light. The British used starfish sights, controlled fire zones designed to look like burning cities. When the Luftwaffe launched night raids over Britain, these decoy sites drew bombs away from real urban areas. They used carefully timed explosions, burning oil, and flickering lamps to simulate devastation. From the air, it was indistinguishable. Reports after the war revealed that thousands of bombs fell harmlessly on empty fields while real cities survived. Another technological marvel was inflatable deception. The Americans perfected it. Inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery could be deployed in hours. Each was painted with precision, weighted to hold shape, and placed at angles that produced realistic shadows under sunlight. Reconnaissance aircraft could not distinguish them from genuine armor. Soldiers could carry them folded under one arm, then inflate them into a convincing division by noon. Radio deception tied all these illusions together. The Ghost Army used fake radio networks to impersonate real divisions. Operators memorized the habits of real signal corpsmen, their timing, slang, and message length. German interceptors who listened believed they were tracking multiple Allied units when in reality they were hearing a single group of American artists in uniform, sitting beside wooden tanks and rubber jeeps. On the tactical front, these illusions became tools of manipulation. At one point, during the approach to the Rhine in 1945, the Ghost Army simulated a massive buildup near the town of Krefeld. They inflated hundreds of fake vehicles, broadcast tank noises, and generated false radio chatter. German forces shifted their defense to meet the Phantom Army. The real American units crossed the river at another point with minimal resistance. The deception saved lives and shortened battles. The psychological impact was enormous. German pilots began to distrust their own photographs. Intelligence officers hesitated before giving orders. Commanders delayed strikes, uncertain whether they were seeing reality or an illusion. That hesitation, even for a few hours, could change the course of a campaign. Leadership within the Allied command recognized the strategic importance of deception. General Bernard Montgomery and General Omar Bradley both approved large-scale decoy operations before key offensives. The lessons of North Africa, Italy, and Britain had shown that illusion could achieve what brute force could not. When Operation Fortitude was planned, deception was treated as a weapon equal to artillery or armor. Enemy perception was the battlefield. German intelligence believed they understood Allied patterns. They relied on aerial photos, radio intercepts, and captured reports. The Allies fed those habits. Every photograph they allowed the Luftwaffe to take, every intercepted message, was carefully prepared bait. Hitler's belief that the main invasion would strike at Calais became one of the most consequential errors of the war. But the Germans were not completely blind. They developed counter-deception units, training analysts to spot inconsistencies in Allied reports and photos. Yet even they struggled to separate truth from fabrication. The precision of the illusions was too great. By the time suspicion arose, the damage had been done. Resources had been diverted, fuel wasted, divisions misplaced. Morally, the decoy war carried a quiet irony. It turned destruction into protection. Each bomb that exploded harmlessly over wood or rubber was a victory of intellect over violence. Each false signal that misled a bomber meant hundreds of civilians spared. The war had reached a stage where truth became a liability and illusion a shield. The emotional weight of this deception fell heavily on those who built it. They lived in silence, unable to share their achievements. The men who risked their lives under wooden tanks and inflatable artillery knew their victories would never be public. Their work would remain secret for decades. Yet they accepted that anonymity because their success depended on invisibility. Every war creates its heroes. Some charge under fire, others fight in shadows. The builders of wooden tanks belonged to the latter. They turned imagination into defense and illusion into strategy. The deception campaigns of World War II became a model for future conflicts. From Korea to the Cold War, nations studied how misdirection could manipulate perception. Modern warfare would soon use radar echoes, decoy missiles, and fake installations, all rooted in the lessons learned when carpenters and artists built tanks of wood and paint. The laughter of the German pilots in 1944 was not misplaced. It was the sound of arrogance. They believed they were looking at weakness. In truth, they were staring at mastery. The world was beginning to see that in war, the most dangerous weapon might not be what could kill, but what could convince. Spring 1944. The war had entered its decisive phase. In the fields of southern England, beneath the constant roar of engines, an invisible army prepared to fight a war of shadows. Operation Fortitude South had begun. Its goal was not to attack, but to convince. The Germans must believe that the Allied invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. The illusion demanded total control of perception. Along the English coast, near Dover and Kent, hundreds of dummy landing craft lined the beaches. From a distance, they looked ready for departure. Wooden ramps, mock engines, and painted markings added to the realism. Dummy tanks filled the fields nearby, positioned in perfect formation. Fake depots were stacked with wooden crates. Roads were marked with artificial tire tracks leading to nowhere. Overhead, reconnaissance planes recorded everything. German intelligence analysts studied the photographs and concluded that the Allies were preparing an assault across the Strait of Dover. It was the most logical target. Pas-de-Calais was close, heavily fortified, and connected by strong infrastructure. The deception worked because it aligned with enemy logic. The mastermind behind the illusion was General Bernard Montgomery, supported by the London Controlling Section, a secret body responsible for deception strategy. They coordinated every detail with MI5, the Royal Engineers, and the American Ghost Army. The operation was so vast that even many Allied soldiers believed the fake armies were real. At the heart of Fortitude South was the creation of a phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It existed only on paper, maps, and air photographs. To complete the illusion, the Allies assigned a real commander to this imaginary force, General George S. Patton. Known for his aggressive reputation, Patton's mere association gave credibility to the deception. The Germans respected and feared him. If Patton was in Kent, they assumed he would lead the invasion. Every detail supported the story. Radio operators in FUSAG transmitted fake signals around the clock. Trucks painted with unit markings drove in circles to simulate movement. Soldiers erected tents and washed laundry in visible areas to create the illusion of a populated camp. Artists painted insignias for divisions that didn't exist. From above, it was perfect. Meanwhile, the real invasion force gathered hundreds of miles away along the southern and western coasts of England. The fate of Europe depended on keeping that secret. If the Germans concentrated their defenses at Normandy too soon, the landings could fail. The wooden tanks, the fake airfields, and the Phantom Army were the first line of defense, built not from steel, but from deception. In May, Luftwaffe pilots flew new reconnaissance missions. What they saw confirmed everything their intelligence officers had reported. Heavy troop presence near Dover, landing craft ready, Patton's headquarters active. They saw what the Allies wanted them to see. When those pilots returned, they reported with confidence. Berlin believed them. By June 5th, the day before D-Day, the deception reached its peak. Weather reports indicated rough seas across the Channel, suggesting that no invasion could occur. Allied meteorologists, however, found a small break in the storm and made their move. Operation Neptune, the real invasion, would strike Normandy. As Allied troops prepared to board real landing craft hundreds of miles away, the Phantom Army stood silent in Kent. Its fake vehicles, its empty tents, its wooden tanks, all of it waited under cloudy skies. No gunfire, no movement, only illusion. At dawn on June 6th, the German command center at Calais received urgent reports. Allied paratroopers had landed in Normandy. Beaches were under attack. Yet, Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht refused to believe it was the real invasion. They assumed Normandy was a diversion, a feint before the main blow at Calais. The deception had succeeded too well. For 2 critical weeks, Hitler kept the 15th Army, nearly 150,000 soldiers and hundreds of tanks, stationed near Calais, waiting for an invasion that never came. Those forces might have crushed the Normandy beachhead in its fragile first days. Instead, they remained idle, misled by wooden tanks and phantom divisions. Even as Allied troops pushed inland, German intelligence continued to report false activity around Dover. They intercepted Patton's radio signals. They saw fresh tire tracks and dummy craft still floating in harbors. The illusion endured. It was not until late July, almost 2 months after D-Day, that the Germans finally realized the truth. By then, it was too late. The Allies had broken through Normandy, liberated Paris, and were advancing toward the German border. The laughter of those early Luftwaffe pilots had turned into disbelief. Their own reconnaissance had betrayed them. They had bombed illusions, misread shadows, and fought ghosts. The climax of deception was not an explosion or a charge. It was silence, the quiet victory of falsehood over arrogance. The bombs that fell on wooden tanks in Kent were not wasted. They were investments in confusion. They bought the time and space for the greatest amphibious invasion in history to succeed. The Allies had proven that in modern warfare, truth could be shaped, bent, and weaponized. In the days following D-Day, the full power of illusion revealed itself. The Germans were not just deceived about location, they were trapped by their own conviction. Operation Fortitude's success depended on sustaining the lie long after the beaches were invaded. Every move, every signal, every decoy had to keep the illusion alive. In Kent and Sussex, the phantom 1st U.S. Army Group continued to prepare for invasion. Trucks drove in circles, kicking up dust. Soldiers set up tents at night and packed them away before dawn to suggest constant troop rotation. Radio messages referenced fake units, fake supply shortages, fake delays. Even Allied newspapers hinted at upcoming operations across the Channel without revealing where. The deception breathed like a living organism. Intercepted German intelligence confirmed that Berlin still expected a second assault. Hitler believed Normandy was a diversion meant to distract from the real attack at Calais. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, he ordered the 15th Army to hold position, ready to repel Patton's supposed landing. That single decision gave the Allies the time they needed to secure their foothold in France. By mid-June, Allied forces had landed more than 300,000 men in Normandy. But to maintain the deception, the illusion had to evolve. The Ghost Army deployed new dummy formations across southern England. Inflatable tanks appeared in new fields. Fake supply dumps and artillery zones were built overnight. Reconnaissance planes flying over still found evidence of a massive, unmoving force near Dover. The Germans continued to take the bait. On June 20th, Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported large concentrations of enemy armor still near Folkestone and Dover. Preparations for Channel crossing appear ongoing. The truth was that those armored divisions were nothing more than air-filled rubber and wooden shells. Behind the front lines, Allied deception officers monitored every intercepted German message. Their task was to read the enemy's mind, to predict when doubt would start to form. Whenever cracks appeared, they responded with new illusions. More radio chatter, more dummy vehicles, more fake movements. The longer the Germans hesitated, the more irreversible their failure became. By early July, the Allies had broken out from Normandy. The German front began to crumble under constant pressure. Yet Hitler still refused to move his Calais reserves. His faith in the false intelligence, built upon months of carefully orchestrated deceit, blinded him. One Luftwaffe officer later admitted in a post-war interrogation, "We were certain Patton would come at Calais. Every photograph, every message confirmed it. When we realized the truth, the war had already turned against us." The brilliance of Fortitude lay not only in its execution, but in its patience. The Allies never overplayed their hand. They allowed the deception to unfold naturally, feeding into German expectations without breaking the illusion. By the time the truth became undeniable, the outcome of the war had shifted. The bombs that had once fallen on wooden tanks in North Africa and empty airfields in Britain now symbolized a greater victory. Deception had grown from field experiment to strategic doctrine. The same logic that once fooled pilots into bombing plywood now guided the most critical operation of the entire war. The climax of the wooden tank story was never about wood or paint. It was about belief. The Germans had trusted their eyes and their instruments. They believed in what they saw because war had taught them to. The Allies turned that trust into their greatest weapon. When Allied troops finally reached Paris in August 1944, the truth began to surface. Intelligence units discovered that the Germans had maintained a defensive formation near Calais long after the invasion. Hitler's generals had delayed reinforcement requests for weeks, waiting for an attack that would never come. What began as carpenters hammering boards together in the English countryside had helped open the path to Europe's liberation. The wooden tanks had done their job. They had drawn real bombs from real planes. They had convinced an empire that shadows were armies and silence was strength. The success of deception did not end at Normandy. It became a model for every major Allied campaign that followed. In Italy, in the Pacific, and finally in the closing months of the war in Germany, illusion continued to shape strategy. Bridges, airfields, and entire supply chains were hidden or replicated to confuse the enemy. Each wooden tank, each inflatable vehicle, each fake signal became part of a vast network of human creativity working quietly beneath the noise of war. When the war finally ended in 1945, most of these units dissolved back into obscurity. Their achievements were classified, their stories untold. Yet the consequences of their work echoed across history. The laughter that had once filled the cockpits of German reconnaissance planes was gone. In its place remained silence, the silence of realization that even the most powerful army can be defeated not by strength, but by perception. The bombs had fallen on illusions. The truth had won through deceit. And the war's turning point had been shaped not by generals on the battlefield, but by the unseen hands of those who built worlds out of wood and imagination. When the smoke cleared over Europe, the war had left behind ruins and revelations. Among the ruins lay the quiet evidence of a different kind of victory, one that had been built with canvas, plywood, and patience. The Allied deception campaigns, once secret, now began to surface in post-war reports and military briefings. For the first time, commanders could see the scale of what had been achieved. Operation Fortitude had saved countless lives. Historians would later calculate that the 2-week delay in German reinforcements after D-Day allowed the Allies to secure Normandy at far lower cost. Each day bought by deception meant fewer casualties on the beaches and fewer cities bombed into dust. Intelligence officers compiled their data. German reports revealed a consistent pattern of misinterpretation. Luftwaffe pilots had photographed dummy airfields and convinced their superiors they were real. Reconnaissance divisions had logged hundreds of non-existent tanks. Radio intercepts showed that the Wehrmacht had redirected artillery and fuel to defend positions that did not exist. The economic cost to Germany was staggering. Hundreds of tons of bombs had been dropped on empty landscapes. Fuel was burned, manpower wasted, and aircraft lost in raids against illusions. In a war already stretched thin by logistics, this was not just embarrassment, it was depletion. Allied leaders studied the psychological aftermath as well. They realized that deception had done more than protect. It had humiliated the enemy's confidence in its intelligence network. When soldiers begin to doubt what they see, the chain of command weakens. That doubt spread across the German ranks like rust. Reports became cautious. Orders were delayed. Belief, once broken, could not be restored. Within the Allied ranks, the recognition was quiet but profound. The men of the Ghost Army and the Camouflage Directorate returned home without fanfare. Their work had remained classified, buried under decades of secrecy. Many returned to their old professions, painters, architects, engineers, never speaking of what they had done. But their legacy endured in the doctrines of modern warfare. The British and American militaries documented their deception operations in confidential archives. These reports later formed the foundation of post-war psychological and information warfare tactics. The lessons were clear. Visibility is vulnerability, and belief is a weapon. In 1946, military analysts reviewing aerial photos of the war zones were struck by how effective the deceptions had been. Even from modern vantage points, the fake installations were nearly indistinguishable from real ones. The illusion had been perfect because it had been crafted not only for the eye, but for the mind. As Europe rebuilt itself, remnants of the deception war remained scattered across fields and forests. Farmers plowed through rusted nails, rotted planks, and fragments of rubber from forgotten dummy tanks. Children in Normandy found hollow artillery shells made of wood. These relics became silent witnesses to a chapter of war fought without bullets. For the soldiers who had lived among these illusions, memory carried a strange duality: pride and grief. They knew their creations had saved lives. They also knew that the war's brutality continued elsewhere, untouched by their art. Yet even in that paradox, they had found purpose. The Allies had proven that imagination, when disciplined by strategy, could alter history. The wooden tanks that once drew laughter had become symbols of something greater: the power of intellect over destruction. The quiet fields of England, where carpenters and artists once worked under blackout skies, had changed the course of the war. And though the guns had fallen silent, their illusions still lingered in the minds of those who had believed them. In the years that followed, the story of the wooden tanks began to surface slowly. Most of the men who built them remained silent, bound by secrecy and humility. It was not until decades later that the truth became public. In 1996, the U.S. Army declassified much of the Ghost Army's records, revealing the full scope of their operations. The documents stunned historians. For 50 years, one of the most creative and successful military units in history had gone unrecognized. Across Britain, similar stories emerged. Veterans of the Camouflage Directorate came forward with photographs, sketches, and blueprints of their creations. Many of them had long since returned to civilian life, designing theaters, advertising campaigns, or museum exhibits. They spoke not of heroism, but of craftsmanship, of measuring angles, painting shadows, and fooling the most dangerous enemy in the world. The numbers spoke clearly. Allied deception operations from North Africa to Normandy misled German intelligence more than 30 times on a strategic level. The Luftwaffe alone dropped thousands of bombs on empty targets. German commanders, trusting these reports, often misdirected armored units by hundreds of miles. Each mistake cost time and fuel, weakening their ability to resist the Allied advance. In 2013, the surviving members of the U.S. Ghost Army finally received formal recognition from Congress. A bill honored their unique and distinguished service during World War II. For men who had lived in silence for decades, it was a long-awaited validation. They had fought without firing a shot, yet their impact had been immense. Post-war military strategy absorbed their lessons. Deception became institutionalized. NATO war planning, Cold War intelligence, and even modern digital warfare traced their roots to these early operations. Inflatable decoys evolved into radar jammers, false signal emitters, and electronic warfare systems. The battlefield had changed, but the philosophy remained the same. The most effective defense is to make the enemy see what you want them to see. Psychologically, the wooden tanks also changed the moral equation of war. For the first time, deception had proven capable of saving lives on a massive scale. The Allied command calculated that the use of decoys had prevented thousands of civilian and military deaths. Every bomb that struck an empty field meant one less family destroyed. Even the enemy learned. Post-war German officers interviewed during the Nuremberg investigations admitted their admiration for the Allied deception networks. Some described them as art in service of war. The irony was complete. Those who once laughed at wooden tanks ended up studying them. In the decades that followed, museums began to honor the forgotten deceivers. Exhibits appeared across the United States and Britain. Visitors could see life-sized replicas of the inflatable Shermans, photographs of dummy airfields, and diary entries from soldiers who had built illusions under fire. Each display carried the same quiet message. Victory does not always belong to those who kill the most, but to those who think the best. The physical evidence of the deception war has mostly vanished. The wooden frames rotted, the paint faded, the fields returned to grass. Yet the legacy endures in every strategic headquarters and intelligence academy that studies how belief can shape battle. The men who built the wooden tanks did not fight for fame. They fought for an idea that creativity could be armor. The Germans who once mocked them learned the cost of arrogance. Their overconfidence blinded them to the possibility that imagination could be deadlier than steel. When the last of the deceivers passed away, their legacy stood tall. They had changed warfare forever, proving that even in humanity's darkest chapter, invention could triumph over destruction. The war of illusion had ended, but its truth remained. History remembers the explosions, not the silence that made them possible. The wooden tanks never fired a shell, yet they reshaped the outcome of a world war. They proved that perception is power, and that control over what the enemy believes can be more decisive than any weapon. The men who built these illusions understood something that few others did. War is not only fought in fields and skies, but in the human mind. Each fake shadow, each painted turret, each broadcast of static and engine noise worked to fracture certainty. They turned confidence into hesitation. In that hesitation, lives were saved. The legacy of their work stretches far beyond the 1940s. Every modern deception tactic, from radar spoofing to digital misinformation, carries a trace of the same idea born in the fields of Kent and the deserts of North Africa. What began with wood and fabric evolved into a philosophy that still defines warfare today: the battle to control perception. But beneath the strategy lies a deeper reflection. These men built illusions not to kill, but to protect. Their success was measured by bombs that missed, by enemies misled, by lives preserved. In a war defined by destruction, they found a way to wage creation. The Germans once laughed at wooden tanks. They saw weakness and folly. Yet those same tanks would lead them to waste bombs, time, and faith in their own vision. The laughter faded into disbelief, then silence. In that silence lies the true power of deception. It is not loud, not glorious, not written in medals or monuments. It endures quietly. In the lessons it left behind, that truth can be shaped, that imagination can defend, and that even in war, intellect can triumph over violence. The decoy armies of World War II remind us that strength is not always measured in firepower. Sometimes it lives in the minds of those who dare to think differently. And long after the last wooden tank has rotted into the soil, the idea that saved nations still stands, unseen, uncelebrated, but undefeated.